Brief summary of Paul Tillich's The Courage to Be. The courage to be what, I hear you ask? Well, the principal ideas put forward in this work are: considered from the ethical point of view, courage in a man is a sign of his caring for something enough to decide and to act despite opposition. Considered in terms of its effect on his being, ontologically, courage is the self-affirmation of one's being. These points of view are united in the conception of courage as the self-affirmation of one's being in the presence of the threat of non-being. Anxiety is the felt awareness of the threat of non-being, and courage is the resolute opposition to the threat in such a manner that being is affirmed. 3 types of anxiety: ontic, moral, and spiritual, the anxiety of fate and death, of guilt and condemnation, of emptiness, are present in all cultural ages, but spiritual anxiety is predominant in the modern period. Existential anxiety cannot be removed, can be faced only by those who have the courage to be. The courage to be involves the courage to participate, to be oneself, and to unite the two by absolute faith in the God above God, being itself. In fact, I'm needing some courage to get through this because people keep sending me messages while I'm talking. I'm sorry about the background noises. Anyway, I shall continue. The material in Tillich's book, The Courage to Be, was first presented in the form of a series of lectures given at Yale University in 1950-51 under the sponsorship of the Terry Foundation. The central task which the author has assumed in these lectures is that of a dialectical analysis and phenomenological description of courage as a structural category of the human condition. Courage, as understood by the author, is both an ethical reality and an ontological concept. As an ethical reality, courage indicates concrete action and decision which expresses evaluational content. As an ontological concept, that is, as illuminating a feature of being, courage indicates the universal and essential self-affirmation of one's being. Tillich argues that these 2 meanings of courage must be united if a proper interpretation of the phenomenon is to be achieved. In the final analysis, the ethical can be understood only through the ontological. Courage as an ethical reality is ultimately rooted in the structure of being itself. These 2 meanings of courage have been given philosophical consideration throughout the whole of the history of Western thought. The author provides a brief historical sketch of the attempt to deal with the phenomenon of courage by tracing its development from Plato through to Nietzsche. There is first a tradition which begins with Plato and leads to Thomas Aquinas. In the thought of Plato and Aristotle, the heroic aristocratic element in courage was given priority. Plato aligned courage with the spirited part of the soul which lies between reason and desire and then aligned both courage and spirit with the guardian class, which lies between the rulers and the producers. The class of guardians, as the armed aristocracy, thus gave the Platonic definition of courage an indelible, heroic, aristocratic stamp. Aristotle preserved the aristocratic element by defining the courageous man as one who acts for the sake of what is noble. However, there was another current of thought developing during this period. This was the understanding of courage as rational, democratic, rather than heroic, aristocratic. The life and death of Socrates, and later the Christian tradition, gave expression to this view. The position of Thomas Aquinas is unique in that it marks the synthesis of a heroic, aristocratic ethic and society with a rational, democratic mode of thought. With Stoicism, a new emphasis emerges. Taking as the ideal sage the Athenian Socrates, Stoics became the spokesman for an emphatic, rational, democratic definition of courage. Wisdom replaces heroic fortitude, and the democratic universal replaces the aristocratic ideal. The courage to be for the Stoics was a rational courage indicating an affirmation of one's reasonable nature, or logos, which countered the negativities of the non-essential or accidental. But this courage to be, formulated independently of the Christian doctrine of forgiveness and salvation, was ultimately cast in terms of a cosmic resignation. The historical significance of the ethical thought of Spinoza, according to the author, is that it rendered explicit an ontology of courage. This ontology of courage was one which made the Stoic doctrine of self-affirmation central, but which replaced the Stoic idea of resignation with a positive ethical humanism. Nietzsche stands at the end of the era, and in a sense is its culmination. Nietzsche transformed Spinoza's substance into life. Spinoza's doctrine of self-affirmation is restated in dynamic terms. Will becomes the central category. Life is understood as will to power. Courage is thus defined as the power of life to affirm itself in spite of its negativities and ambiguities, in spite of the abyss of non-being. Nietzsche expressed it thus: "He who with eagle's talons graspeth the abyss, he hath courage." Tillich, in formulating his ontology of courage, keeps the tradition from Plato to Nietzsche in mind. His definition of courage as the universal self-affirmation of one's being in the presence of the threat of non-being receives its final clarification only in the light of the historical background which he has sketched. In the author's definition of courage, the phenomenon of anxiety is disclosed as an unavoidable consideration. Courage and anxiety are interdependent concepts. Anxiety is the existential awareness of the threat of non-being. Courage is the resolute facing of this anxiety in such a way that non-being is ultimately embraced or taken up into being. Thus, the author is driven to formulate an ontology of anxiety. There is first a recognition of the interdependence of fear and anxiety. Fear and anxiety are distinct but not separate. Fear has a determinable object, a pain, a rejection by someone who is loved, a misfortune, the anticipation of death. Anxiety, on the other hand, has no object, or, paradoxically stated, its object is the negation of every object. Anxiety is the awareness that non-being is irremovably a part of one's being, which constitutes the definition of human finitude. Anxiety and fear are thus distinct, yet they are mutually immanent within each other. Fear, when it is deepened, reveals anxiety, and anxiety strives toward fear. The fear of dying ultimately ceases to be a fear of an object, a sickness, or an accident, and becomes anxiety over the non-being envisioned after death. And conversely, anxiety strives to become fear because the finite self cannot endure the threatening disclosure of non-being for more than a moment. The mind seeks to transform anxiety into fear so that it can have a particular object to deal with and overcome. But the basic anxiety of non-being cannot, as such, be eliminated. It is a determinant of human existence itself. The author distinguishes three types of anxiety. 1. Ontic anxiety, or the anxiety of fate and death. 2. Moral anxiety, or the anxiety of guilt and condemnation. And 3. Spiritual anxiety, or the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness. Fate threatens man's ontic self-affirmation relatively. Death threatens it absolutely. The anxiety of fate arises from an awareness of an ineradicable contingency which penetrates to the very depths of one's being. Existence exhibits no ultimate necessity. It manifests an irreducible element of irrationality. Behind fate stands death as the absolute threat to ontic self-affirmation. Death discloses the total ontic annihilation, which is imminent in every moment of our existence. For the most part, man attempts to transform this anxiety into fear, which has a definite object. He partly succeeds, but then realizes that the threat can never be embodied in a particular object. It arises from the human situation as such. The question then is posed, is there a courage to be, a courage to affirm oneself in spite of the threat against man's ontic self-affirmation? Non-being threatens on another level. It threatens by producing moral anxiety, the anxiety of guilt, which threatens relatively, and the anxiety of condemnation, which threatens absolutely. The self seeks to affirm itself morally by actualizing its potentialities, but in every moral action non-being expresses itself in the inability of man to actualize fully all of his potential. He remains estranged from his essential being. All of his actions are pervaded with a moral ambiguity. The awareness of this ambiguity is guilt. This guilt can drive man toward a feeling of complete self-rejection, in which he experiences the absolute threat of condemnation. The question then arises whether man can find the courage to affirm himself in spite of the threat against his moral self-affirmation. Lastly, there is the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness, which reveals the threat to man's spiritual self-affirmation. Emptiness threatens this self-affirmation relatively, meaninglessness threatens it absolutely. Emptiness arises out of a situation in which the self fails to find satisfaction through a participation in the contents of its cultural life. The beliefs, attitudes, and activities of man's tradition lose their meaning and are transformed into matters of indifference. Everything is tried, but nothing satisfies. Creativity vanishes, and the self is threatened with boredom and tedium. The anxiety of emptiness culminates in the anxiety of meaninglessness. Man finds that he can no longer hold fast to the affirmations of his tradition, nor to those of his personal convictions. Truth itself is called into question. Spiritual life is threatened with total doubt. Again the question arises, is there a courage to be which affirms itself in spite of non-being? In this case, non-being expressed in the threat of doubt, which undermines one's spiritual affirmation through the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness. These three types of anxiety find a periodic exemplification in the history of Western civilization. Although the three types are interdependently present in all cultural ages, we find that ontic anxiety was predominant at the end of ancient civilization, moral anxiety at the end of the Middle Ages, and spiritual anxiety at the end of the modern period. The anxiety of fate and death was the central threat in the Stoic doctrine of courage. It received expression in the transition from Hellenic to Hellenistic civilization, which saw the crumbling of the independent city-states and the rise of universal empires, introducing a political power beyond control and calculation, and it is present on every page of Greek tragical literature. In the Middle Ages, the anxiety of guilt and condemnation was dominant, expressed in the theological symbol of the wrath of God and the imagery of hell and purgatory. Ascetic practices, pilgrimages, devotion to relics, institution of indulgences, heightened interest in the Mass and penance, all witness to the moral threat of non-being as it manifests itself in guilt and condemnation. Modern civilization, born of the victory of humanism and the Enlightenment, found its chief threat in the threat to man's spiritual self-affirmation. Here the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness becomes dominant. Democratic liberalism calls into question the security and support of an absolute state. The rise of technology tends to transform cells into tools and thus displace man's spiritual center. Skepticism replaces philosophical certitude. All cultural contents which previously gave man security no longer afford satisfaction and meaning. Modern man is threatened with the attack of emptiness and meaninglessness. The author concludes his ontology of anxiety by distinguishing existential anxiety. In the three types discussed, from pathological or neurotic anxiety, existential anxiety has an ontological character and is thus understood as a universal determinant of the human condition. Existential anxiety cannot be removed. It can only be courageously faced. Pathological anxiety, on the other hand, as the result of unresolved conflicts in the socio-psychological structure of personality, is the expression of universal anxiety under special conditions. It is the consequence of man's inability to face courageously his existential anxiety, and thus take the non-being which threatens into himself. The neurotic self still affirms itself, but it does so on a limited scale. Such affirmation is the affirmation of a reduced self which seeks to avoid the non-being that is constitutive of his universal finite condition. But in thus seeking to avoid non-being, the neurotic self retreats from the full affirmation of his being. Hence the author's definition of neurosis as the way of avoiding non-being by avoiding being. The neurotic personality always affirms something less than what he essentially is. His potentialities are sacrificed in order to make possible a narrow and intensified affirmation of what remains of his reduced self. The neurotic is unable to take creativity into himself, the universal existential anxieties. In relation to the anxiety of fate and death, this produces an unrealistic security comparable to the security of a prison. Since the neurotic cannot distinguish what is to be realistically feared from those situations in which he is really realistically safe, he withdraws into a castle of false security so as to insulate himself from all threats of existence. In relation to the anxiety of guilt and condemnation, pathological anxiety expresses an unrealistic perfection. The neurotic sets up moralistic self-defenses against all actions which would widen the horizons of his reduced and limited actualized state, which he considers to be absolutely perfect. In relation to the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness, which expresses itself in a radical existential doubt, pathological anxiety drives the self into an unrealistic certitude. Unable to face the doubt regarding the contents of his cultural tradition and his personal beliefs, the neurotic constructs a citadel of certainty from which he fends off all threat of doubt on the basis of an absolutized authority. This absolutized authority may be either a personal revelation, a social or religious institution, or a fanatical leader of a movement. In any case, he refuses to accept doubt and rejects all questions from the outside. He is unable courageously to accept the reality of meaninglessness as a universal phenomenon in existential reality. The courage to be is the movement of self-affirmation in spite of the threat of anxiety as the existential awareness of non-being. This courage is conceptually clarified by the author through the use of the polar ontological principles of participation and individualization. The basic polar structure of being is the polarity of self and world. The first polar elements which emerge out of this foundational polar structure are the elements of participation and individualization. The relevance of these elements to Tillich's doctrine of courage is evident. Courage expresses itself as the courage to be as a part, exemplifying the polar element of participation, and as the courage to be as oneself, exemplifying the polar elements of individualization. Finally, these two polar exemplifications of courage are transcended and united in absolute faith. Absolute faith grounded in transcendence provides the final definition of the courage to be. First, the author examines the manifestation of courage as the courage to be as a part. This is one side of man's self-affirmation. He affirms himself as a participation in the power of a group, a historical movement, or being as such. This side of courage counters the threat of losing participation in his world. The social forms which embody this manifestation of courage are varied. The author briefly discusses 4 of these forms: collectivism, semi-collectivism, neo-collectivism, and democratic conformism. All of these forms attempt to deal with the 3 types of anxiety: ontic, moral, and spiritual, by channeling their individual expressions into an anxiety about their group. Thus it becomes possible to cope with these existential anxieties with a courage that affirms itself through collective or conformal participation. The individual anxiety concerning fate and death is transcended through a collective identification. There is a part of oneself belonging to the group which cannot be hurt or destroyed. It is as eternal as the group is eternal, an essential manifestation of the universal collective. So, also a self-affirmation is made possible in spite of the threat of guilt and condemnation. Individual guilt is translated into a deviation or transgression of the norms of the collective, and the courage to be, as a part, accepts guilt and its consequences as public guilt. The anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness is dealt with in the same way. The group becomes the bearer of universal meaning, and the individual derives his personal meaning through a participation in the group. The ever-present danger in the radical affirmation of the courage to be as a part is the absorption of the self into the collective, with the consequent loss of the unique, unrepeatable, and irreplaceable individual. The courage to be as oneself expresses the other side of man's self-affirmation. This movement is made possible through the ontological polar element of individualization. The courage to be as oneself has found a concrete embodiment in Romanticism, naturalism, and existentialism. Romanticism elevated the individual beyond all cultural content and conferred upon him a radical autonomy. In some of its extreme expressions, as in Friedrich von Schlegel, the courage to be as oneself led to a complete rejection of participation. Naturalism, whether of the philosophy of life variety or of the American pragmatic variety, follows basically the same path. Nietzsche, in his definition of nature as the will to power, granted priority to the individual will and made it the decisive element in the drive toward creativity. In Nietzsche, individual self-affirmation reached a climactic point. American pragmatism, in spite of its roots in democratic conformism, shares much of the individualistic attitude characteristic of European naturalism. It finds its highest ethical principle in growth, sees the educational process as one which maximizes the individual talents of the child, and seeks its governing philosophical principle in personal, creative self-affirmation. It is in existentialism that the courage to be as oneself is most powerfully presented. Tillich distinguishes 2 basic expressions of existentialism, as an attitude and as a philosophical and artistic content. Existentialism as an attitude designates an attitude of concrete involvement as contrasted with an attitude of theoretical detachment. Existentialism as a content is at the same time a point of view, a protest, and an expression. But in all of its varieties, existentialism is the chief protagonist for the reality of the individual and the importance of personal decision. It is concerned to salvage the individual from the objectivization of abstract thought, society, and technology alike. The existentialist struggles for the preservation of the self-affirmative person. He fights against dehumanization in all of its forms. The task of every individual, according to the existentialist, is to be himself. Heidegger has profoundly expressed this existentialist courage to be as oneself in his concept of resolution, Entschlossenheit. The resolute individual derives his directives for action from no external source. Nobody can provide for one's security against the threat of ontic annihilation, moral disintegration, or spiritual loss of meaning. He himself must decide how to face his imminent death, how to face his moral ambiguity, and how to face the threat of meaninglessness, which strikes at the root of his existence. If I may just put it in aside, all this meaninglessness thing, if only they would read Hegel, I might sort that out for them. Anyway, I continue. We have seen that the danger in the courage to be as a part is a loss of the self in the collective. The opposite danger becomes apparent in the various forms of the courage to be as oneself, namely a loss of the world as a polar structure of selfhood. The question then arises whether there can be a courage which unites both sides of man's self-affirmation by transcending them. Courage understood as absolute faith exemplifies this union through transcendence, a courage which can take the three types of anxiety creatively into itself must be grounded in a power of being that transcends both the power of oneself and the power of one's world. The self-world correlation is still on this side of the threat of non-being, hence neither self-affirmation as oneself nor self-affirmation as a part can cope successfully with non-being. The courage to be, in its final movement, must be rooted in the power of being itself, which transcends the self-world correlation. Insofar as religion is the state of being grasped by the power of being itself, it can be said that courage also has either an explicit or implicit religious character. The courage to be finds its ultimate source in the power of being itself and becomes manifest as absolute faith. As long as participation remains dominant, the relation to being itself is mystical in character. As long as individualization remains dominant, the relationship is one of personal encounter. When both sides are accepted and transcended, the relation becomes one of absolute faith. The two sides are apprehended as contrasts, but not as contradictions which exclude each other. This absolute faith is able to take the threefold structure of anxiety into itself. It conquers the anxiety of fate and death in its encounter with Providence. Providence gives man the courage of confidence to say, in spite of, to fate and death. Providence must not be construed in terms of God's activity, but as a religious symbol for the courage of confidence, which conquers fate and death. Guilt and condemnation are conquered through the experience of divine forgiveness, which expresses itself in the courage to accept acceptance. The courage to be in relation to guilt is the courage to accept oneself as accepted in spite of being unacceptable. That's a quote from Tillich. I don't actually regard myself as being unacceptable, but anyway, maybe to others, which I suppose, never mind. In relation to the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness, the courage to be, based on absolute faith, is able to say yes to the undermining doubt and to affirm itself in spite of the threat. Any decisive answer to the question of meaninglessness must first accept the state of meaninglessness. This acceptance constitutes a movement of faith. But there's the problem for me, because I don't accept it. Anyway, moving on. To quote Tillich, the act of accepting meaninglessness is in itself a meaningful act. It is an act of faith. Through his participation in the power of being itself, man is able to conquer emptiness and meaninglessness by taking them into himself and affirming himself in spite of. The content of absolute faith is the God above God. Tillich rejects the God of theological theism, who remains bound to the subject-object structure of reality. A God who is understood as an object becomes an invincible tyrant who divests man of his subjectivity and freedom. This is the God whom Nietzsche pronounced dead, and against whom the existentialism has justifiably revolted. Theism must be transcended if absolute faith is to become a reality. The God above God is the power of being itself, which as the source of absolute faith is not bound to the subject-object structure of reality. Being itself transcends both self and the world and unites the polarities of individualization and participation. The courage to be, which is ultimately grounded in the encounter with the God above God, thus unites and transcends the courage to be as oneself and the courage to be as a part. This courage avoids both the loss of oneself by participation and the loss of one's world by individualization.